first 5 verses. Let me just read the first 5 verses again so we just have clearly the vision before us. He showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. And the Lord said unto Satan, The Lord rebuke thee, O Satan, even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is this not a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and stood before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment. And I said, Let them set a fair mitre upon his head. So they set a fair mitre upon his head, and clothed him with garments. And the angel of the Lord stood by. As I mentioned, our text this morning contains the 4th vision of a series of visions that the Lord gave to Zechariah. This vision, as was the case with the 3 that preceded it, was designed to comfort and encourage the remnant in Jerusalem who were at that time struggling to rebuild the temple following their return from the Babylonian captivity. This 4th vision of Zechariah is somewhat different, though, from the 3 that preceded it. It's different for a number of reasons. Unlike the visions that preceded it, the focus of this vision is upon a real historical person in the form of Joshua the high priest. Furthermore, in this vision, Zechariah is not only a bystander who asks questions of the angel of the Lord. If you were to read the earlier parts of Zechariah, you discover that's the role that Zechariah played in those first 3 visions. He simply inquired of the angel of the Lord. But here in this 4th vision, he is also an active participant in what's depicted in the vision. In this vision, Joshua the high priest provides a vivid type or picture of Jesus Christ, the real high priest. It's significant to note that the name Jesus was the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua or Yeshua. Joshua in his name and in his priestly office was a picture of Jesus Christ, the real high priest who stood before God in the place of the elect and who removed their sins by taking those sins upon himself, thereby delivering them from the power and the bondage of sin and Satan. Very little is known of the Joshua of our text. The priesthood of Aaron, to which Joshua belonged, had really passed into obscurity during the Babylonian captivity, only to suddenly re-emerge again post the captivity in the person of this Joshua. It was Joshua as the high priest who, along with Zerubbabel, that led the 50,000 strong remnant back to Jerusalem from Babylon. As the high priest, naturally the rebuilding of the temple was of vital interest to this Joshua. You find reference to him in passages, for example, such as Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1. We read there, in the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month and the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and then notice this, and to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest. As the high priest, Joshua stood as the representative of the people of God before the Lord. He interceded with the Lord on their behalf. He pleaded for the forgiveness of their sins, and he did that especially before the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. And in order to really grasp the significance of this 4th vision, it's necessary to appreciate the connection between this 4th vision and the 3 that preceded. In the first three visions given to Zechariah, the Lord revealed the blessings that he would bestow upon his beleaguered church. And those visions revealed the nations that had spoiled Judah would be judged. They also revealed the temple in Jerusalem would be rebuilt. Furthermore, Jerusalem itself would be restored and the church would be expanded to the four corners of the earth. And above all that, the greatest blessing that the Lord promised to Judah was that he would come and dwell in their midst. And that leads into the vision of our text. The Lord would come and dwell in the midst of Judah. But how could that be? How could a righteous and holy God, a God who is holy and pure, how could he possibly dwell in the midst of a sinful people? And that's exactly what the remnants residing in Judah were. They were a sinful people. The Lord coming to dwell in their midst was only possible if their sins had been forgiven and put away. As to how that was possible is the fundamental message of the vision of our text. In this vision, Joshua, as the representative of the people, stands before the Lord in the Holy of Holies, robed in filthy rags or filthy robes. And so what we have in the vision is a sinful high priest representing a sinful people standing in the presence of a righteous and holy God. A seemingly incongruous situation. The incongruity, and by incongruity I mean something that doesn't fit really. The incongruity was something that was not lost on Satan himself. And on the basis of what he saw as the inconsistency of a sinful high priest standing in the presence of a righteous God, Satan protests Joshua's presence in the Holy of Holies. By way of response, the angel of the Lord instructs his servants to remove Joshua's filthy garments and to clothe him in pure garments. And clothed in such garments, Joshua, as the representative of the people of God, stands in the presence of God, clean and pure, free from the defilement of sin. In this fourth vision, we have vividly set before us the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the only way of salvation. So that's what I trust to unfold a little, brethren, as we work our way through this vision this morning. I've titled this sermon, Brands Plucked Out of the Fire. Brands Plucked Out of the Fire. I divide the sermon under these three headings: the satanic contention, secondly, the divine rebuke, and then finally, the gracious provision. This fourth vision opens with these words, and the reference there is to God himself, the Lord of hosts. And he showed me, references Zechariah, showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord. Now, the angel of the Lord is the messenger of the Lord, and the messenger of the Lord is none other than the pre-incarnate Christ. So the reference really here to the angel of the Lord is, in fact, to Jesus Christ himself. So we find that Joshua the high priest stands before the angel of the Lord, and Satan stands at his, that is, at Joshua's right hand, to resist him. Now, before descending into the detail of the vision, it may be helpful to offer the following observations. In the opening verse, we're actually introduced to the three central characters of this vision: to Joshua the high priest, to the angel of the Lord, and also to Satan. It's also noteworthy that neither Joshua nor Satan speak in this vision, though both are integral to its content and meaning. A cursory consideration of the vision might leave the impression that Joshua, the angel of the Lord, and Satan are the only persons mentioned in the vision. But a more careful analysis reveals that that's not so. A closer consideration of the vision reveals that there are more than just three persons involved directly or indirectly in this vision. In verse 4, for example, note that the angel of the Lord speaks to an unidentified group that stood before him. We read there, and he, the angel of the Lord, answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. This same group is also mentioned again in verse 7 of chapter 3, and I'll leave you to read that for yourselves, but they're also mentioned there. And it's evident that those who make up this group are connected with the Lord's house and the courts of the Lord. Furthermore, they are responsible for doing the bidding of the angel of the Lord. For example, he commands them, take away the filthy garments from Joshua. It's plain that this group consists of those ministering angels or spirits who waited upon and who served the angel of the Lord. It should also be noted that the setting of this vision is the temple in Jerusalem, and specifically the temple in Jerusalem on the Day of Atonement. The setting of this vision is the temple in Jerusalem on the Day of Atonement is evident from the accusations that Satan directs against Joshua and the references in the vision to the distinctive priestly garments worn by Joshua. That's found in verses 4 and 5, where we read, And he, the angel of the Lord, answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him, that is from Joshua, and unto him, that is Joshua, he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment. And then we find that Zechariah interposes, And I said Zechariah, Let them set a fair mitre upon his head. So they set a fair mitre upon his head and clothed him with garments. The Day of Atonement, as you'd be well aware, was the day on which expiation and propitiation was made for the sins of the nation of Israel. Though theological terms, we do not tend to speak of expiation and propitiation all that much, though both concepts are actually vital as regards our understanding and comprehension of salvation. Expiation concerns the taking away of guilt through the payment of a penalty or the offering of an atonement. And by an atonement I mean there the making of amends for a wrong or injury. So expiation concerns the taking away of guilt through the payment of a penalty, while propitiation has to do with the object of the expiation, that is, the one whose wrath is being appeased or whose injury is being appeased. In theology, expiation concerns the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made on the cross of Calvary to cleanse sinners from their pollution, the pollution of their sin, and to remove the guilt of their sin from them. On the other hand, propitiation concerns the assuaging or appeasement of God's wrath by the life and death of Jesus Christ, so that sinners such as you and I are restored to God's favour and fellowship. Now, both expiation and propitiation were central components of the Day of Atonement. The nation of Israel as a whole and every individual within the nation was guilty of sinning against God. And the Day of Atonement was an acknowledgement of that fact and of the need that the children of Israel had for both expiation and propitiation. The children of Israel needed to acknowledge their sins, and they needed to have their sins addressed. Their sins had to be covered, they had to be put away. They needed to be reconciled to God so that the wrath of God might be appeased. And so both expiation and propitiation were symbolised in what took place on the Day of Atonement. But what took place on the Day of Atonement? You can read of that if you wanted to in Leviticus chapter 16. But on the Day of Atonement, the high priest took the blood of a bull and a goat from the altar of burnt offering in the outer court of the temple and entered into the Holy of Holies, that is, into the inner sanctuary of the temple, where he came before the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat that overlaid the Ark of the Covenant, and there he sprinkled the blood of those animals, the bull and the goat, upon the mercy seat. The significance of the sprinkling of the blood upon the mercy seat lay in the fact that within the Ark of the Covenant there were 2 tables of stone, and recorded on those 2 tables of stone were the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments summarised the whole of the law of God and represented God's absolute and unchangeable standard of righteousness. A standard that the children of Israel, sadly day by day, month by month, year by year, repeatedly violated. So therefore the 10 Commandments bore witness of the sinfulness of the children of Israel. They highlighted and specified the children of Israel's sin and their guilt. Now, in order to symbolically address the children of Israel's sin and guilt, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter alone as the representative of the people into the Holy of Holies and into the very presence of God. And he would do that on 2 occasions. On the first occasion, he would bring with him the blood of a bullock slaughtered on the altar of burnt offering, and then he would sprinkle the blood of that bullock upon the mercy seat. He did that as symbolising the need that he and his own family had for the atonement of their sins. That in the first place. Then on the second occasion that he entered into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, the high priest brought with him the blood of a goat, which he also sprinkled upon the mercy seat. And the blood of that goat was designed to make atonement for the sins of all the people. So on the Day of Atonement, the high priest interceded with the Lord firstly for the sins of himself and his family, and then secondly for the sins of all the people. Now, significantly, so far as our vision is concerned, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest did not dress in the usual garments that are described in the scriptures as the garments of glory and beauty. We haven't time to go into those, but the high priest normally what were described as the garments of glory and beauty. They were in fact colourful, splendid garments. But instead of wearing those colourful and splendid garments on the Day of Atonement, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest entered into the Holy of Holies robed in pure white. You read of that in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 4. We read there, he shall put on the holy linen coat, and he shall have the linen breeches upon his flesh, and he shall be girded with the linen girdle, and with the linen mitre shall he be attired. These are holy garments, therefore shall he wash his flesh in water and put them on. The linen coat, the linen breeches, the linen girdle, and the linen mitre, which was really a cap or a hat that the high priest wore, were all white. They were all white. And the high priest's white attire was to symbolise the spiritual purity and perfect holiness required of anyone who would come into the presence of the holy and righteous God. It should be noted that in connection with our vision, that the high priest's attire on the Day of Atonement included a linen mitre or turban. This was the mitre to which Zechariah makes reference in verse 5 of our text. And that mitre or head covering was the glory and complement of the high priest's attire. You might describe it as his crowning glory. And it's interesting, if you were to turn into Exodus 28 and verse 36, you discover that fastened to that mitre was a golden plate on which was engraved the words, "Holiness to the Lord." Holiness to the Lord. Now, keeping in mind that the setting of this fourth vision is the temple on the Day of Atonement, let's turn to the vision and the details of the vision itself. We find Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord and Satan standing at his right hand, and we're told Satan is standing there to resist him. So what Zechariah sees is Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel or messenger of the Lord in the midst of the Holy of Holies. As to why Joshua is standing there is not stated, but the reason becomes quickly obvious. Joshua, as the high priest, has come into the Holy of Holies in order to undertake the duties that belong to the high priest on the Day of Atonement. He's there to sprinkle the blood of the bull and the goat upon the mercy seat. He's there to make atonement for his own sins and for the sins of the people. He stands before the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ, and he stands there in his own right as well as in his office as the high priest and as the representative of all the people. He stands before the angel of the Lord for judgment, so that judgment might be passed with respect to himself and all the people. In a way, the setting is really the setting of a court, with the angel of the Lord as the presiding judge. And the reason that Joshua stands before the angel of the Lord for judgment is because Satan has taken up a position of opposition against him. Satan stands at Joshua's right hand, we're told, to resist him. Now, Satan stands there as Joshua's accuser or adversary. This is what the Hebrew word for Satan actually means. And in fact, it's what the Hebrew word translated resist also means. Literally, Satan stood there at Joshua's right hand to oppose him. And that, of course, is consistent with the role that Satan has always played with respect to the people of God. You might recall that in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10, there John writes, "And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now has come salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down." It's a reference to Satan. "The accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night." It's interesting to note that that accusation of Satan referenced there in Revelation 12 was the accusation that those Old Testament saints that had died prior to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ had no right to a place in heavenly glory. Satan's reasoning was that the Old Testament saints had no right at that point in time to a place in heavenly glory because Jesus Christ had not died, and consequently their sins had not been covered. They were still in their sins and as such had no right to appear in the presence of God. And here in our vision, Satan appears to resist Joshua, and not only Joshua, but also all of those whom Joshua represented. And his position at Joshua's right hand indicates the apparent strength of his case against Joshua and against all whom Joshua represented. And in many ways, the accusation that Satan brings here against Joshua is similar to the one that's referenced in Revelation chapter 12. Satan's accusation, not articulated, though clearly implied, was that Joshua and all those that he represented had no right to attend before the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. Joshua had no right to be there, had no right to make atonement for sin, had no right to make atonement for his own sins, and he certainly had no right to make the atonement for the sins of others. After all, Joshua was a sinful man. Moreover, the people whom he represented were a sinful people. Now, this was evident because Joshua was not clothed in the holy and pure linen garments that the high priest was required to wear on the Day of Atonement. What was Joshua wearing? Verse 3 tells us, "Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and stood before the angel." Joshua's robes were not the pure white garments, the garments of purity required by the law of God. They were not clean, they were not pure. In fact, Joshua's garments, we are told, were filthy. And the Hebrew word translated in verse 3, filthy, is used elsewhere in Scripture to refer to human excrement. it's a word that's also employed in the scriptures to refer to the drunkard's vomit. Joshua's garments were putrid. They were smeared with human excrement. He was robed in stinking, filthy garments, and yet here he is appearing in the presence of God, purporting to make atonement for the sins of himself and for the people. He comes in those stinking, filthy garments into the presence of the infinitely holy and righteous God. As the prior priest, he had come to represent not only himself, but also the people. He comes in filthy and stained garments, though. He comes stained in his own iniquities, and he comes stained in the iniquities of all the people. Now that was something that was unheard of. No high priest would dare to come into the presence of God clothed in such manner. And Satan takes the issue up. Satan, one might say, is outraged. I'm not sure that's quite the term in a way with Satan. But certainly Satan feigns outrage that such a thing should occur or that it should be permitted. He resists Joshua's presence, clothed in the way that he was in the presence of the Lord. It was obvious that Joshua, of course, was defiled with his own sin and with the sins of the people. That was undeniable. Joshua was a sinner. The people were sinners. They were all weak in faith. They all lacked zeal and dedication to the Lord. They all became easily despondent. They were all full of fears, prone to self-interest, neglectful of the work of the Lord. They stood in daily need of daily repentance. Sounds very similar, doesn't it, to ourselves? And Satan's contention was that being clothed in such filthy, sin-stained garments, Joshua had no right to appear in the presence of God. When you think about it, there was actually validity. There was validity to Satan's contention. Joshua, clothed in the way that he was, had no right to come into the presence of the Holy God. And the relevance of that, brethren, to us is this: that's the same thing for us. As sinners, and that's the reality, all of us are sinners. We're repeat offenders, we're recidivist offenders. We sin day by day, and we will continue to sin day by day until the Lord calls us home to glory. The truth is that we're all sinners, and as such, we actually have no right, no entitlement to actually appear in the presence of God. In that sense, we're no different to Joshua nor to the children of Israel. We have no right, no entitlement to come into the presence of God. Our robes, put it in the terms of the vision, our robes are filthy. They're filthy robes. And Satan's resistance to Joshua's presence before God, in truth, would equally apply to each one of us. No right, no entitlement to come before the Lord. What could Joshua say in response to Satan's contention? What could we say if those contentions were raised with respect to us? Well, the truth is, there's nothing we could actually say. There's nothing, in fact, that Joshua could say. He was clothed in sin-stained garments, and as such he was unfit to enter into the presence of God. That's why we have nothing to say. We also clothed in sin-stained garments, and we have no right to enter into the presence of the Lord. But here's the gospel. Joshua didn't have anything to say, but the angel of the Lord did. The pre-incarnate Christ had something of enormous and everlasting significance to say. Listen to what Jesus Christ had to say to Satan. He says this, verse 2, "And the Lord said unto Satan," the reference there, the first Lord is a reference to the angel of the Lord. "The angel of the Lord said unto Satan, The Lord rebuke thee, O Satan. Even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this," and he's referring there to Joshua, "is not this a brand plucked out of the fire?" Before Satan can press home his contentions, the angel of the Lord speaks. The angel of the Lord rebukes Satan in the name of the Lord. He rebukes him in the name of Jehovah, in the name of the covenant-keeping God, in the name of the God of all mercy and grace. And he rebukes him for his assertion that Joshua had no right to come into the presence of God, contending that Joshua and the children of Judah were sinners and thereby having no right to appear before the Lord. Satan had spoken the truth, but he had not spoken the whole truth. In that regard, notice that the basis for the rebuke of Satan was not the righteousness and purity of Joshua, nor the righteousness and purity of those whom he represented. Joshua and the people were sinners, just as you and I are sinners. Notice that the angel of the Lord does not say to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan," because Joshua and those that he represents are righteous, free from sin and guilt. It doesn't assert that. Indeed, in and of themselves, he could not assert that because it wasn't true. Now, Joshua was clothed with filthy garments. His garments were not just slightly soiled, but they were covered with filth. Notice that the basis for the rebuke of Satan was the electing love of God. Verse 2, "And the Lord said unto Satan, The Lord rebuke thee, O Satan." Notice this, "even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee." The basis for the rebuke of Satan was that the Lord had chosen Jerusalem. The Lord, out of his mercy and grace, had elected Jerusalem. He had specifically chosen Jerusalem. He had chosen a people unto himself. And notice that the reference here is to the past tense. He has chosen. Past tense. The Lord had already bestowed his unmerited favour upon Jerusalem. He bestowed his unmerited favour upon the church of God of that day, the church of God whom Joshua represented. The Lord had chosen a people unto himself in love. He had chosen them in Jesus Christ. And he'd done that before the world began. Before the world began, the Lord had set his love upon that people. Yes, Joshua was a sinner. And yes, those whom he represented were sinners. But what Satan failed to disclose was that they were sinners saved by grace. They were sinners that the Lord had chosen to be his own. They were those sinners upon whom the Lord had set his love. They were those sinners whom he had chosen and purposed to redeem in Jesus Christ. And as such, they had a right then and now to appear in the presence of God. They were justified sinners, but justified not on account of their own righteousness, but they were justified on account of the righteousness of Jesus Christ, whose perfect righteousness had been put to their account. They, like Joshua, were brands plucked out of the fire. And brethren, by God's grace, that's what you and I are. We are brands plucked out of the fire. Joshua and the remnant in Judah had been plucked out of the fire, literally out of the fire and destruction of Babylon. By God's grace, you and I are brands plucked out of the fire of everlasting destruction in hell. A brand, or a firebrand as it's also referenced in Scripture, was a stick that was used to poke and stir up a fire. If you've ever been camping, you probably have engaged in that exercise. The fire's burning and the coals are there, you've got sticks on the fire or logs on the fire. You want to move something around in the fire, and so you just cast around, you find a twig or a stick that you can poke the fire with. That's the idea here. It's really of a spindly branch of a tree that's being used to stir up the coals of an open fire. That branch serves a lowly purpose. What do we often do when we actually have that stick and we stoke the fire with it? Well, after we've done that, and perhaps it's caught alight a bit and become blackened, quite often we just simply cast that into the fire itself. And that stick then is burnt up and consumed in the fire. Again, that's the idea here. It's as though we are like that stick, we're like that brand that's been perhaps used to stoke the fire or cast into the fire. And we're brands plucked out of that fire. The word plucked means, or can be translated also, snatched or rescued from the fire. That, brethren, is what Jesus Christ does for us. Without Jesus Christ, we would be consumed. We'd be in the fire, and the fire would be those spindly sticks, and we'd catch on fire, and we'd be consumed, and we'd turn to ashes. But the work of Jesus Christ is such as his mercy and grace, that he reaches into that fire and plucks out that brand from the fire. We actually deserve to be consumed. Perfectly right if we were left in the fire. But here in this vision we're given a sight of the infinite mercy and grace of Jesus Christ, who plucks that twig, that stick, out of the fire and makes it to be his own. Joshua and the remnant in Judah were like such a brand. And by God's grace, that's true of you and me. By God's grace, we've been snatched from the fire of everlasting destruction. You might even say that we've been rescued from the fire of hell by a hair's breadth. In and of ourselves, we're worthless burnt sticks. The Lord in his mercy and grace, and according to his electing love, has snatched us in and through Jesus Christ from destruction. That's the good news. That's the good news. That's the gospel, as appears in this vision given to Zechariah. We are brands that have been plucked from the fire. Very quickly, let's notice what flowed from the fact that Joshua was a brand plucked out of the fire. That's verse 4. We're told there, and he, the angel of the Lord, answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and will clothe thee with change of raiment. Though Joshua was chosen of the Lord, a brand plucked out of the fire, the question remained, how could he stand, though, in the presence of God in those filthy garments, those sin-stained garments? That couldn't be. Joshua needed new garments, and the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ, provided those garments. He commands those that stood before him, take away the filthy garments from him. He says, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee. All this is descriptive of the work of Jesus Christ. Descriptive of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. The filthy garments are removed, and Joshua is provided with new garments. I will clothe thee with a change of raiment. And the reference there is, the change of raiment is to pure raiment, to white robes. You should notice that these were not Joshua's garments, but they were the garments provided to him by the angel of the Lord. The garments provided to him by Jesus Christ. They were the garments of the righteousness of Jesus Christ. In these words you hear, I haven't time to go into it, but you hear the language of justification. Here we see Joshua's sin removed and the righteousness of Christ being imputed to him. And these are the benefits that belong to every believer. Our sins removed and the righteousness of Christ were imputed to us. And then notice finally, quickly, the angel of the Lord records how, or we have recorded here how that Zechariah says, let them set a fair mitre upon his head. It seems as though Zechariah is so elated at what he's been given to see, he can't restrain himself. He becomes an active participant in the vision and calls out, let them set a fair mitre upon his head. The angel of the Lord had spoken about Joshua's garments. What about his crowning glory? What about the mitre? What about the mitre that bore the inscription, Holiness to the Lord? The mitre that proclaimed him and all whom he represented as holy and acceptable unto the Lord. What about that? And so they set, we are told in verse 5, so they set a fair mitre upon his head and clothed him with garments. The result was that Joshua was fully covered in robes of purity and righteousness. And so here Joshua represents a picture of one covered in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And really here we have pictured for us Joshua as the real high priest. Really another picture of Jesus Christ, Joshua, the real high priest, who would one day enter into the real Holy of Holies. That's what we read about in Hebrews 9. The real high priest who would enter one day into the real Holy of Holies, into heaven itself, clothed not in an alien righteousness, but in his own perfect righteousness, bringing not the blood of bulls and goats, but the real blood of atonement, his own blood shed upon the cross of Calvary. Brethren, we are brands plucked from the fire. How grateful, how thankful should we be that the Lord has deigned to bestow his mercy and grace upon us. Let's remember that. Let's give thanks for that, marvel at that as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning. Amen.